I would now like to introduce our last speaker, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. I'm sure many of you know him, in addition to being a practicing anesthesiologist and a former CEO of a hospital. He can also be heard on KURV on his weekly Talkback program. And he is also much sought after to speak on topics including abortion and the right to life and the Constitution and the Supreme Court. Dr. Gelman.
Thank you. The First Amendment says that the Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Thank you. Or abridging the freedom. It's an affirmation that I'm quoting it correctly. Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people to peaceably assemble or petition the government for grievance or for grievances. And you'll notice that the term wall of separation of church and state does not exist in there. In fact, wall nor separation nor church appears in the First Amendment. So where does that come from? Well, as alluded to earlier, it comes from the correspondence between the Danbury Baptists of Connecticut and the new President Thomas Jefferson. The Danbury Baptists wrote this letter to Thomas Jefferson: so that religion is considered as the first object of legislation, and therefore what religious privileges we enjoy as favors granted and not as inalienable rights. And these favors we receive at the expense of such degrading acknowledgments as are inconsistent with the rights of free men. Thomas Jefferson, wishing to allay the fears of the Danbury Baptists that were afraid of the bringing in of the same type of philosophy as alluded to earlier that existed in Europe, in which the church was part of the state, and activities which even occurred in the United States. Many of the colonies, including Massachusetts, where the Pilgrims came into, they established a religion in the state and were intolerant to other forms of religion. And so many new states were created by those disaffected through the imposition of religion as a church in government in other colonies. So in order to allay the fears of the Danbury Baptists and of all Americans with the newly created country, Thomas Jefferson responded, I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declare that their legislature would make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, which of course is directly from the First Amendment. And then he adds, thus building a wall of separation between church and state. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a very smart person, and it's extremely important to understand that how he distinguishes the term religion from church, which is exactly what James Madison did as well. Unfortunately, the government wants to confuse those terms in order to achieve a certain agenda. Religion is a spiritual belief. A church is an organization, a physical representation of a religion with a hierarchy and an order of governance, which is very similar to any other form of government. And so what Thomas Jefferson was saying is that we will not allow a particular church to gain ascendancy in the United States, thereby guaranteeing the expression of all religious beliefs. Now, I think it's important that we understand that this is not an argument between those who believe in God and those who do not believe in God. The government could not care less about that. In fact, the tradition and history of governments is that they use God in order to further their own aims, and our government is certainly not averse to doing that. The issue between God and government is in authority. Where does the authority come from to which the people ought to adhere? In communist countries, the first thing they do is they eliminate all religious activities. Now, why is that? It's been a long, long time since the Pope had an army. Why was it necessary for communist countries to eliminate the religious expression in their countries? It's simply because that where were the people to tie or tether their allegiance? Was that allegiance to be to government, or was it to be to God? And so government tries to be God as a divine right of kings, or eliminates God so there is no other authority competing with the government. So that is the battle that's going on. It's not a battle between atheists and those who believe in God. It's a battle as to who's going to have the power in a nation. Now, I want to discuss a couple of terms, and which I think are important, because there's a lot of confusion as to what they mean. The law, what is the law? Well, the law is nothing but a bunch of rules that are imposed by an authority that can force those rules upon you. That's all the law is. There's no morality associated with laws. I get very irritated at these so-called conservative pundits, who I believe are actually working for the Democrats. When they talk about the rule of law, what is the rule of law? The rule of law is what the Nazis did. When the Nazis said that a Jew was no longer a citizen of the country and had no rights as a citizen, that was the law. And anyone that disobeyed the law was punished. So therefore, anyone that married a Jew or harbored a Jew or protected a Jew, that person was breaking the law. The law has no moral compass. It is simply the rules imposed by the authorities in power. So the rule of law means absolutely nothing. Now, what is legal? Well, legal is nothing other than what adheres to the law. Being legal carries no morality, has no ethics associated with it. It is simply adhering to the law of the land. And so therefore, if you live in the Soviet Union, it is your obligation under the law to turn in anyone that is practicing religion. That is the law. And so morally, in the Soviet Union, if you knew of someone that was practicing religion and you did not turn them in, you were acting unethically in the Soviet Union. So we have to be careful how we use the terminology. Now, is legal the same as legitimate? Well, of course not. What is legitimate and what is legal? Well, they're not synonyms. Legitimate is the justification for something. That is what makes something legitimate. So therefore, if something is constitutionally legitimate, it means there's justification in the Constitution. Legal means nothing other than laws were passed. Now, you can have laws in this country that are legal. The personal income tax is legal. The passing out of condoms in schools is legal. The Affordable Care Act is legal. Medicare and Medicaid, legal. Are they constitutional? Of course not. They're not constitutional. They're not legitimate, because the Constitution says you cannot do that. The Constitution does not allow the benefiting of some at the expense of others. And so we have a country that is acting, our government is acting unconstitutionally. And I think for any of us to believe that we can vote these people, we can vote in a constitutional government, I think you're kind of whistling Dixie. And that's for all you Northeasterners. What is a right? Does anyone understand what a right is? I don't. Does anyone understand? I guess you can ask that later, but I would sincerely doubt anyone knows what a right is. Well, it's really hard to know what a right is, so it's much better to see what a right is not. It's one of those things, well, I'm not sure what a right is, but I know what's not a right. And really, it's very simple. No one has the right to the fruits of another's labor. That is essentially how you address a right. If you look at the United States, food stamps, subsidies, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, which are entitlements. which of course is a misnomer, and it's a misappropriation of a term. But the confusion brought about in the United States as to what these terms actually mean is purposeful, and it's promulgated through our system of education and the media, which are nothing but arms of the government. Why should we be surprised? That's exactly what all governments do in the world. If I were to ask someone, are the newspapers in Russia or the Soviet Union legitimate? And you would say, well, of course not. They're run by the government. And do you think ours are any different? Ours are exactly the same. I remember I was talking with an attorney who was in Washington, and we had a debate. And you know, for me, to debate a constitutional attorney is like a pop gun against a howitzer. I mean, I have no chance. And because they play by a different set of rules, so our argument went from point to point to point. And he was parrying with his, with his foil, and I was trying to defend myself the best I could. But he was just toying with me, and ultimately he came out with the ace that trumped everything that I said. And the ace was that it didn't matter what was right or wrong. It didn't matter that precedents being used were not legitimate. All that mattered was winning. And that's the way our government functions. All they care about is winning. The Constitution is the law of the land. And there's a process of amendments which have corrupted the Constitution purposefully. Now, the Constitution is not malleable. Now, they talk about the Constitution as being written 200 years ago, and therefore it hasn't kept up with the times. Because 200 years ago, there was no jet plane, there were no internet, and no cell phones. But if one looks at Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, or any of his symphonies, or Mozart or any of the rest, are they not perfect in their form 200, 300 years ago? Are they not perfect? Are they malleable? Should they be changed to conform with Lady Gaga and Madonna? I think we would say no. And so the Constitution is perfect. It doesn't matter that it's 200 years old, because what is the Constitution? The Constitution defines the relationship between the people of a nation and its government. And that's all it's meant to do, is define that relationship. And that relationship is not meant to change whether you're using a drum to transmit a message or a cell phone. Because the relationship between the government and the people is not to change. And what is that relationship? The relationship is this: that the government is servant to the people, and that the government cannot augment its power under any circumstances. By the 9th and 10th Amendment, the government is not permitted to augment its power under any circumstances whatsoever. And any augmentation of power defaults to either the people or the states. And so what we have is a government which is completely unconstitutional. Now, I don't know how many people in the audience think that Medicaid is good, or Medicare is good, or Social Security is good, or food stamps is good. I imagine that most people seem to think that if we abandon those programs, that somehow the poor would die in the street. But the fact of the matter is that those programs exist to enslave, and the government's function is to enslave as many people as possible, because that keeps the government in power. And the easy way to understand what those programs do is that all the money in food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and all the rest ends up in the hands of the wealthy, not in the hands of the poor. It ends up in the hands of the wealthy who are contributors and cronies and relatives of politicians. And what's new about that? Nothing. It's the way the world works. But the propaganda machines that we see with Tom Brokaw and Walter Cronkite and Katie Couric and all the other useful dupes and fellow travelers is to justify what the government does. Because the government can't say, I'm going to take your money and give it to my wealthy friend because you won't buy his stuff. I'm going to take your money and I'm going to give it to him. And most people would say, well, that's not right. So they have to justify it. And how do they justify it? They create a program. And the program says, I'm going to take your money against your will, and I'm going to give it to a poor person for their health care, for their food, for their housing, for their transportation. And then they disarm you. Because if you say, I don't want you taking what I have earned to give it to people that I don't know, oh, then you're a heartless person. You don't care about the poor. And so that's the way they get you, okay? Now, the federal government just gave New Jersey $50 billion because of some minor incident due to a weather anomaly. The state of New Jersey is not worth $50 billion. Now, why do I want what I earn through my labor taken from me by force by the government to give to somebody in New Jersey so that they don't have to work? Now, is that moral? They try to say that's a moral thing, but you see how they twist and turn the terminology. What is moral and what's not moral? To me, why someone to impose their morality upon me? But that's what they're doing, isn't it?
Yes.
They say gay marriage, we should allow it because that's the moral thing. Because just because they're perverts doesn't mean that they don't have constitutional rights. And they are perverts. I don't have anything against them particularly, I just don't want them teaching my children that it's normal. That's the problem. If you want to behave that way, that's fine. Do it. But don't be teaching my children that's a normal variant. What is the definition of perversion? If we look at the definitions of terms, we'll understand what's going on. What's the definition of perversion? Basically getting something to function in a way other than it was meant. By definition, homosexuality is perversion. You want to do it? Do it. Don't teach my children that it's normal. Same-sex marriage. I mean, obviously, that's a perversion. But look at the way they turn around. Look, I got a phone call today. Some guy from the Democrat Party called. Said that contribution, whatever, and that Governor Perry had closed down 30 or something of the 47 women's clinics, and women are not going to be able to get health care in the state of Texas. And I informed her that I think there's more than 47 clinics in the state of Texas to take care of women. But she was just a propagandist, some kid reading off some piece of paper. But they're all being brainwashed. So look what is it? Women's rights, right? Look at the way they use the terminology. Look at the way they turn it against us, okay? That it's a women's rights issue. Or that it's there's a right to marriage. There is no right to marriage. The word marriage doesn't occur in the Constitution. There's no right to marriage. There's no right to many things that they say are rights. I had a rabbi tell me the other day that he had a right to health care. So we had a little discussion about that before I threw him out of the house. But no, this is someone that was trained in Yale, which seems to be really a hotbed of this kind of talk. Someone that's trained in Yale and says they have a right to health care. So what is that? So what is that? I'm just for a minute, and I'm going to finish because it can go on forever. Health care is a product. It costs energy. You got to go to medical school, you got to build the equipment, you got to create the medications. That's labor, the fruits of someone's labor. Does anyone have the right to take the fruits of someone else's labor? Of course not. There is no right to health care because health care is a commodity. The same as there's no right to a car, there's no right to food, there's no right to health care. But I would bet you 75% of the people have asked the question, is there a right to health care? Well, what kind of sense does that make? 50 years ago, there was no heart surgery. There were no angioplasties, CAT scans, MRIs, and all that. That was all created by individuals, very smart, who created what the healthcare that we have today. So if you think about it for a second, okay, in 1950 you have the right to health care. What does that mean? Everybody seems to think that there's this entity called healthcare, which is static, unchanging, and that somehow we all deserve access to it simply because we exist. That's not true. Somebody has to come, a doctor has to go to the emergency room. Somebody has to build the CAT scanner. Somebody has to develop the drugs. It costs a lot of money, takes a lot of energy, takes a lot of effort. And now they're saying that someone has a right to the fruits of that person's labor. This is the corruption of language that George Orwell referred to in 1984. The corruption of language, which makes us believe one thing versus another thing. And we believe it and we accept it because we keep getting drummed into our heads that this is the way it ought to be. At one time, most people in the world thought the world was flat. That did not make the world flat, just because you believe it to be flat. And just because you believe you have a right to health care, or right to an abortion, or right to food stamps, or right to anything else, doesn't make it true. And our founding fathers created a document called the Constitution, and why? Because they could not trust politicians. They had already freed themselves from the grand politician, which is King George III, and freed themselves from the divine right of kings. If men were angels, do you need a constitution? You need a constitution because men are anything but angels. And therefore, and politicians are like the extreme of the worst characteristics of any human being. They have more pride, more gluttony, more wrath, more sloth, more avarice than anyone else. That's why they go into politics. Why does anyone go into politics? Why? Do you ever think about that? What is the purpose? And the only purpose of going to politics? To control the lives of others. That's it. Maybe you have good intentions, maybe you have bad intentions. But the goal is to control the lives of others. Why does someone want to be president who is now mayor? Or why does a senator want to be president? Do they function any differently as president as senator? No. What is the distinction? They control more people. Therefore, beware of anyone who wants to be president. Beware of anyone who wants to be king, because there's no distinction between the two. Why do people want to be king? To control the lives of others. Why does the King of England want to invade France? Being a king of one country not enough? He wants to invade another country because he wants to control the lives of others. That's the only reason politicians go into politics. It's the psychology of that individual that says, I was born with the right to control the lives of others. And so they built a constitution that said, no, you can't. The Constitution is essentially restrictions on political activity. That's what the Constitution is, restrictions on politicians. And what is the last thing a politician wants? Is to be constrained. They refuse to be constrained, and we see it every single day. And so, to sum up, we live in a fascist tyranny that has completely alienated from our constitutional foundations. We have no relationship to the founding of the nation. We call ourselves the United States of America, means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. We are simply the vestiges of the times past. The country is long gone. We don't exist. Just because we're powerful doesn't make us right. Just because we're powerful doesn't make us good. Neither the fact that we're wealthy, does that make us right or good? At one time, Rome was the strongest empire in the world by far and existed for 1,000 years. And then the Byzantine Empire took over for 1,000 years. And who of us is going to say that Rome was a great empire, or that the Byzantine Empire was a great empire? And where are the pharaohs of Egypt today? And that's where we're headed. You know why I know that? Because if you read history, you'll find out that everything that they did on their path to destruction and perdition is the path that we are following today. Exactly. In every instance. And so, on that optimistic note, I'll conclude. Thank you.
Okay, folks, I'd like to remind you once again about the survey cards. If you could take a moment and fill those out. We'll take about a 5-minute break. If you want to stretch, go to the restroom, get some refreshments, and then we'll have the question and answer period. Okay, in about